Okay, thanks so much for attending tonight. This is our third webinar in a series of webinars about Charleston County's climate action planning process. The first two webinars in this series cover the importance of developing a climate action plan and a low carbon model. And we gathered community feedback about what residents wanted to see in our plan. In addition, for the past several months, we've been holding in-person sessions to gather community feedback on what residents think is most important to be included in this plan. Tonight, the consultants, SSG and Civics, will focus on the cost savings in this plan and will bring it to the county over time and sample recommendations. So we're really excited to get your feedback on some of these sample recommendations. I'm going to turn it over to Erica to go over webinar logistics. And please feel free to jump in if you have any questions, but we do have certain periods of time throughout the webinar where we're going to ask for your feedback. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this evening. My role tonight is to help guide us through some of the more interactive components of the webinar. Before we do that, just a quick introduction to what we'll be talking about. So we have an overview of the project, then looking at some specifics of implementation actions and kind of how those are evaluated. And then we'll get into some examples of some of the actions that could be implemented as part of this plan. Then we'll have an open Q&A. So throughout the agenda, there are moments for you to give feedback. And at any point, as Ariel said, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat. So mute is not really a factor here. If you raise your hand at any point, if you want to speak or ask questions, you're welcome to do that, and we'll activate it for you. We're also going to be using a Mentimeter, which is an online tool for providing feedback, and I'll introduce that in a moment. So you'll be able to provide reactions that way. In addition to the chat, you'll see why it's a little bit different and useful for us. Also, just please be mindful of sharing time and listening to others as we especially get into the discussion component at the end. So to get us set up on Mentimeter, you can scan that code if you want to run it on your phone alongside. You can also follow the link that's in the chat. And third option, you can just go to menti.com and enter the code that you see there. So I'll just flip over to the Mentimeter and start showing you. Great, so you found the test question. Would you rather be able to speak to animals or understand all human languages? So once we see some more people over there, we'll go through the real questions. If you're having any trouble, just leave a note in the chat and we can offer you some guidance. Okay, we'll leave that run, and you can get logged in as you are able to.
Sorry, guys, I see that you're saying the chat is disabled, so I'm working on fixing that.
Yeah, I was like, how do we have no one in the chat? Oh, sorry, that's a sneak preview.
Seems that people are more curious about other species than the human species.
It is true. It does seem. It's the great mystery, you know. We kind of know what the other people are up to, don't we? But we don't really know what the dogs are thinking. Okay. Oops. Let's try going to the right one. There we go. Okay, so we're going to get started with the presentation. I think I'm turning it over to Yul with SSG to tell us
Thank you,
about the low
Erica. So I'm
carbon
going to give
pathway.
you a bit of background on some of the analysis that we've done and some of the findings that we have before we go over to look at some of the actions. So this is the greenhouse gas emissions by sector in 2020. You can see that the largest source is transportation, which is really combustion of gasoline and diesel. It's about 3 million tons or 3 megatons of emissions in 2020. The second, if you click forward a couple of times, the second largest source of emissions is buildings. And if you go back, I've combined residential buildings and ICI, which means industrial, commercial, and institutional buildings. And together they're about 2.1 million tons or 2,100 kilotons. So you can see that transportation is the largest source, followed by buildings, and then all the other sectors are somewhat smaller. Waste is quite small. Fugitive emissions refers to emissions that escape from pipelines primarily. So that gives you a sense of where the emissions are coming from. What we've then done is built a low carbon pathway for Charleston County. And to do that, we start at the total emissions in 2020, which is the top left corner. I think if you click a few more points, that arrow will show up there. Yeah, so that's 6.5 million tons, 6.5 megatons. And then we do a reference scenario, which is the line along the top of all the colors. And that's how much emissions would result if no additional policies or actions are added. We then quantify a bunch of different actions that could be taken, from cleaning the grid to doing building weatherization, building retrofits, to electrifying vehicles. So each of those colored bars represents the emissions as a result of one of those types of actions. When you sum up all those actions, you get a line along the top of the gray area, which is what we call the low carbon pathway. And that's what the emissions trajectory would look like if all the actions are implemented. And then you have the remaining emissions, which is the area colored in gray. So if you keep going, so one thing that we're always very curious about is what is the economic impact of making all of this happen? And we track all of those pieces in a lot of detail. So we track the replacement of vehicles year over year, the energy consumed by each house and each building in Charleston County year over year, and the equipment they're using. And because we have that detail, we can look at what the economic impacts are. So when a house puts in a heat pump rather than a furnace, or a heat pump rather than an air conditioner, or replaces a gasoline car with an electric car, we can represent the financial impact of that. And the financial impact has a few different components. It has a capital component. So an electric car would be, say, $6,000 or $7,000 more than a gasoline car. But it also results in energy or fuel savings over its lifetime. So we track both the fuel savings, the maintenance costs or savings, and the capital cost over time. And so that allows us to calculate the economic impact of that pathway, which is always a really interesting exercise. We've been doing this for a number of years. And when we started doing it, these analyses were very expensive for communities. But that's really changed as the cost of those technologies have come down. So what does it look like for Charleston County? If we go to the next slide, we always want to do it in reference to how much money is being generated or spent within the county. And in Charleston County, the GDP, which is how much money was essentially spent in 2021, was $34.5 billion. If you go to the next slide, implementing that pathway, which I showed you, would cost about $550 million incremental. So on top of what everyone's spending anyways per year on average, between 2025 and 2050. So that is, if you click forward, about 1.5% of the GDP. And that's relatively low. That's not a significant capital increase relative to the GDP. But the good news, if you go to the next slide, is that $550 million generates about $640 million worth of savings. So there's more savings than there is costs, which is the good news story of this project. Of course, there's many complications in terms of making those initiatives and actions happen. But if they could happen, if all of those complications could be overcome, the impact would be net financial savings for Charleston County. Go to the next slide. To highlight a little more detail on some of those costs, if you click forward a couple more times, we track capital and energy cost savings. And one more time, I think. The blue bars are the capital costs. So those are the extra costs of making stuff happen. The yellow bars are the energy cost savings. And you can see that they get bigger and bigger over time as more and more action is taken. But the blue bars are bigger than the yellow bars initially. And that means you have to spend money in order to start making or saving money. If you go to the next slide, this is the black line shows the net. And you can see, if you click forward again, that it flips over. Savings start to exceed costs in 2034. And then they start to exceed costs a lot. So it really starts to generate a lot of savings. So that means that, like many investments in society, it's capital intensive in the early years to get lots of savings in the later years. And so that's a case for amortizing or using some sort of financial mechanism which spreads out those capital costs over time. Go to the next slide. If you sum that up over the period, click forward a couple more times, you can get the total. So this is the sum of the investment from 2025 till 2050. It's $9.8 billion over that whole period. It generates $14 billion of savings, and it has a net cost, or net savings rather, if you click forward one more time, for Charleston County of $6.4 billion. So this implementing a climate action plan for Charleston County results in $6.4 billion of savings over the next 25 years, or 35 years, which is a really, I think, impressive story, and really shows what the economic benefit of the climate action plan is, and that a climate action plan is an economic strategy. If you go to the next slide, there's a further benefit here, which is that Congress has passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which gives an extra, if you click forward a couple more times, an extra $2.9 billion into the mix. That 2.9 million is kind of moved in the wrong place there. It should be on the pink bar. And that results in the savings going from 6 billion to 9.3 billion. That's probably not going to happen because not all of the money that people in Charleston County are eligible for under IRA will actually come to Charleston County. So this is kind of the ultimate best case scenario. But if it did all come, this is what it would look like. If you keep going. So I mentioned that a climate action plan is an economic development strategy, and this really shows how you can start mapping business opportunities to the climate actions. So this is capital investments year over year. You click forward, Erica, you can see that in residential buildings, in order to implement this plan, it requires about $200 million per year in residential buildings. And that's expenditures on heat pumps, on weatherization, on windows, doors, insulation. And so that's really a significant economic opportunity for businesses that are engaged in those activities. And you can really start to map out those opportunities to those businesses and build a whole economic development strategy around that. Go to the next slide. There's another benefit to the climate action plan that isn't represented in terms of the dollars that people experience on a day-to-day basis. And that's the avoided damage from climate change. And we know every ton of emissions does a certain amount of damage globally. It doesn't necessarily occur in Charleston County, but you can sum that up and quantify it. And that is a significant benefit of the emissions reductions resulting from this plan that gets almost to $500 million per year by 2050. But of course, those are benefits that are spread out all over the place. So you can't really count it in the ledger for Charleston County, but it's still important to note. If you go to the next slide, what does this look like for a household? And this is the average household in Charleston County spends about $5,000 on energy per year right now in 2020. If this plan is implemented, that would fall to just under $2,000 per year. And you can see it, most of that expenditure is electricity by the end. And that's because the energy system becomes a lot more efficient. So it actually reduces household energy expenditures, which reduces issues such as energy burden or energy poverty. So that's a really critical element of a climate action plan. And the last elements I'm going to highlight here is that if you make those kind of capital investments that I showed you, then you're going to stimulate a lot of new jobs. And we can calculate how many new jobs because we know for each sector, each activity, how many jobs per $1 million investment are generated. And so we can calculate that it's on average 3,300 person years of employment of work per year. And if you go to the next slide, we can actually see where those jobs occur in which sectors under this plan. So you can really see that a climate action plan is an economic development plan that has many economic benefits for Charleston County. And so I think those are some really interesting findings from our analysis. The next question is, how do you make all that happen? And with that, I will pass it over to Jared.
Very simply, Yul. That's the answer. No, thanks a lot, Yul. That's a great overview of all of the different ways that some major investment now and over the course of the next few years will really pay off. In some cases immediately, and in other cases down the line. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that the Inflation Reduction Act, because we're going to go through a few of those opportunities that right now are on the table for Charleston County and individuals as well to take advantage of major federal investment that's going on right now to lower that capital cost that was mentioned. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about a couple of these. You'll mention the Inflation Reduction Act, which is indeed gigantic, $783 billion that is focused on energy production, carbon emissions reductions. In terms of equity, it's making sure that a lot of these investments are happening in low-income and disadvantaged areas. It's considered the largest single federal program ever to focus on climate, and that's reducing climate impact. That's also, in some cases, hazard mitigation. So a lot of the hazards that Charleston faces, some of the infrastructure work that is funded as part of the IRA is also there to help defend against those hazards. Complementing the Inflation Reduction Act actually came before it was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is often known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And this one in particular, even larger than the Inflation Reduction Act, focuses really on infrastructure. So in some cases, it's traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges. In other cases, it's infrastructure that we know we need to invest in, like renewable energy, and with a focus on reducing energy costs and reducing carbon emissions as well. Those upgrades that we're looking at are really important. This is just one slice of that Inflation Reduction Act overall. This is a look at all of the different types of programs that it funds. You can see really that clean electricity, so renewable energy, reducing that emissions impact is a major portion of the funding here. You can see other ones in here that are worth noting, like reductions in air pollution, clean fuel in vehicles. These are some of the ones that Yul has already mentioned in those capital investments. And then even things like clean manufacturing. So knowing that manufacturing facilities across the county have been really important to job growth and creation over the past few years, this is another way that we can make sure that those factories, manufacturing facilities are upgraded and as modern as they could be so that they have the most sustainable life that they could have. This one. Similarly, with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that more than $1 trillion is spread out across different kinds of infrastructure, including things like reducing emissions for buses and cars, also high-speed internet. So that kind of connectivity that allows for lower carbon or even zero carbon ways for you to live your life. A subset of the Inflation Reduction Act here that's also important that's happening now is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. And I'll say we're going through all of these programs because they are often the foundation of how local governments make these things happen, local and state governments. The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program is $5 billion nearly direct to states and regions to specifically reduce air pollution and specifically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In South Carolina, this is being administered by the State Office of Resilience, or SCORE. SCORE is leading the application to the EPA, who ultimately is stewarding this nearly $5 billion. A lot of that's competitive. So this is something that, while the county itself isn't going to administer these funds, there's this potential for things to either pass through, or if you're interested, to make sure that you're in contact with folks at the state to be able to help influence that effort. So one of the things we really want to take a look at today are the actions themselves. We won't really have time to go into detail of all of the actions, because as they're currently drafted, and again, they're really in flux. We're really in one of our early stages of getting these all together. We've added a lot of details to about 30 actions, but even among those 30 actions, many of them have multiple parts. So what we're going to do today is go over some examples within specific categories, like those categories that Yul mentioned a little while ago.
I'll just ask if anyone has any questions before we go into this next part of the presentation. Please feel free to put up your hand and we can offer any clarifications.
Yeah, please do. Especially when that federal funding stuff can be, full of acronyms, full of jargon, but ultimately it does create one of those foundations for how these programs become a reality. So I will say, even before we get started on going through a couple of the actions and what they might look like for the county, did want to mention that some of the efforts that have already taken place to talk to people around Charleston County about different ways to shape these. So in some cases, things are applicable pretty much across the board. So basically, any community in America might be able to take advantage of some of these programs. And in other cases, having specific understanding about what the county can do, what folks living in the county can do, that becomes really important. I will say that of the many conversations that we've had over the past few months, one of the major points that's come up, whether it's been with community conversations or at county council or among county staff or partners, has been a focus on equity. So I want to make sure I mention that, because one of the ways that these actions become useful and can deliver an equitable outcome is by continuing to engage with this process after the plan is done. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through, but I just want to mention that now, just recognizing that equity is a really major concern for this, and this is a great opportunity to get funding and programs that really matter to communities that could really use it. So we have a number of categories. These are just neat and clean ways to show how these different actions that we can take with this investment can look. So just starting from the top, there are some things that will be pretty straightforward. Energy efficiency. We know that we can make our homes and buildings more efficient and potentially reduce our energy burden. Some are maybe a little less straightforward, like land use and zoning. Land use and zoning is one of those things that underpins how our communities are formed. It's the regulations about how we get around. It's the design of our streets. It's how we create the frameworks to continue to build into the future. One of the things that we hear a lot about in Charleston, of course, is growth and growth pressures, including lots of traffic and lots of pressures on formerly agricultural or forest land or coastal land. This land use and zoning question becomes really critical to creating those balances between preserving spaces and then using them to their highest and best use so that they can be the most efficient places that we have. Transportation goes along with that for sure. Waste reduction and diversion, it's another one. We talk about recycling, but then also, like, how do we make sure that these things don't go in the waste stream in the first place? Agriculture and forestry, a large portion of the land in Charleston County is agricultural and rural. Making sure that we're good stewards of that can really help to maintain or reduce even our greenhouse gas emissions. And renewable energy is a clear one as well. How do we reduce the emissions from not burning fossil fuels in the way that we have, and ultimately reduce those costs? And then the last one there that I skipped over, enabling actions, are all of those things that go on in the background to make these things possible. What are the things that can be done at the county level, in community organizing, in how we organize ourselves together and collaborate together to make policy changes or visions, or set visions that allow all of these other actions to happen. So that's the category level. This is our 30,000-foot look. Now we're going to take a look at a couple examples within these categories. So first one here, again, starting with something that's pretty straightforward in achieving what Yul mentioned before, those reductions in costs and burden. This is single-family home retrofits to create more efficient spaces. The way that the action is drafted today is incentivize owners and operators of existing single-family residential buildings to prioritize energy efficient and renewable energy systems and appliances. You'll see that there's some of that is government speak, just to make sure that we're clear about how we're achieving this. So incentives for owners and operators, making sure that it's categorized appropriately, residential buildings, because residential retrofits might look different from commercial and industrial retrofits. And then on the back end there, the goal is to make them more energy efficient. So what does that look like in order to incentivize? Well, to start, people need to know about it. So an action here would be investing time and resources into outreach and education to homeowners to promote these options that might be a little different. You'll mention things like having a heat pump instead of an air conditioner, or weatherizing your house, things like this. In order to take advantage of a program, you have to know about it. And then on the back end, direct incentives, providing incentives, rebates, technical assistance to those homeowners and operators to be able to apply those retrofits, to contract with installers, to work with to access the actual materials to be able to do it. So the box we have here on the right is really just to illustrate that there are funding options for this today, for both that outreach, for that incentives, those direct rebates or tax credits. A couple of these examples come from the Inflation Reduction Act and other things that might already exist, like the energy efficient home improvement tax credit, home efficiency rebates, which sometimes exist through utilities, and then also rebates for efficient appliances. So this is the kind of stuff that is detailed in a draft plan. So once that plan comes out as a draft for public comment and review, you'll be able to see a variety of these types of examples across different actions.
Yul, before we move forward, we just have a question in the chat. Do nature-based solutions, you see it, and green infrastructure fall in any of the categories listed in the previous slide?
Yeah, if you want to go back to that, Eric, I think it's agriculture and forestry is where we would put those.
May also be helpful to distinguish between adaptation and mitigation.
Yeah, I think, do you want to take that, Yul, or you want me to?
Go for it.
All right. So I think that's a great point, Erica, this difference between adaptation and mitigation. So in a case like for coastal South Carolina, flooding is a major concern. So being able to manage your water so that the volume of water isn't overwhelming the systems that we've already got is going to be really important. Is that something that inherently reduces greenhouse gas emissions? Not necessarily. It is something that is absolutely critical to continuing to thrive in the Low Country, I would say. But when it comes to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions on that diagram of the low carbon scenario, it's not going to make a huge impact. That said, a lot of those kinds of investments can have knock-on effects to reduce energy use, to reduce different kinds of consumption, and depending on the scale of it, could even act as carbon sinks. That would be a very, very large scale, though. I know in some communities where you're pumping a lot of water, so say you have a sump pump now in your house because a portion of your home is experiencing flooding regularly, or in a garage or something that experiences a lot of flooding. Green infrastructure might reduce that flooding, which could then reduce that consumption to pump water into different places. So those are some examples of just how the green infrastructure would slot into this, but not necessarily take center stage in the same way that it would in an adaptation plan. All right, so this is just one quick example, just to quickly illustrate, while obviously not in Charleston, these are different ways that a home could be retrofitted, could take advantage of some of those funding sources, and also a potential retrofit program. Efficient windows, upgraded insulation, electrified heating and cooling, all of these things can reduce your energy consumption to maintain or to climatize your house. Other things like solar panels to very directly use renewable energy at home, and also that native landscaping, flood retention, like we just went over, definitely has an impact on the quality of life at your house or in your community or in your neighborhood, and then also could in fact reduce some of that, ultimately those greenhouse gas emissions.
I noticed a couple of hands flash. Were there anyone who wanted to speak, or maybe it was just a little bit of an error, but if you did, try again. Okay, good. Practicing. Excellent. Quick to the draw. Excellent. Okay, so yeah, great. There's a little conversation going on in the chat, and so we can just leave that one there. So we're going to turn over to Menti again and get a little bit of feedback on the household energy efficiency and retrofit program. So if you haven't already gone there, here's some information for it. It's also up in the early days of the chat. I can repost it in a moment. But we're going to be asking you 3 questions over in the Menti. Just generally, gut feeling, to what extent do you support this action? And then some comments on how this action would benefit the community. Are there specific ways that you think it would benefit you, your neighbors, your friends and family? And what might make it difficult to implement this action? What barriers or issues would we need to develop solutions for? So make sure that's open for you. So I'll just flip ahead to make sure those other 2 are open as well. I think should be able to all access those.
I think one of the interesting things about some of the federal programs that are coming out now is that there's a variety of ways that that someone can take advantage of these programs. So in some cases, the benefit directly goes to an individual or a family. So you could have a tax credit, or there could be a direct rebate on something. In other cases, a tax credit will go to a business that provides a service. So a service like installing solar panels on your house, or giving you a new HVAC system. So that business gets the tax credit so that you can benefit from the savings on that. The other part is the ability for local and state governments to accept some of that funding and turn it around into direct incentives. So all of those different ways, in some cases, they can add up for you, the individual. In other cases, they would be more targeted at the whole community. So there are a variety of ways that just to mention that there's a variety of ways that this funding and these opportunities end up finally creating an impact. Looks like we've got a number of, what have we got? We've got thumbs ups, we've got how would this benefit the community through money savings, climate resilience, lowering bills, decreasing cost of living, and reducing air pollution. It's no coincidence that the EPA has titled this the Climate Pollution Reduction Act, their hallmark program, because that kind of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions really go hand in hand. So those kinds of benefits are really critical to keep track of here. Let's see. Benefiting ecologically and economically. Yeah, reduced taxing of electric grid and infrastructure, and other infrastructure benefits. Yeah, what we've definitely learned in the past decade is that our electric grid, every investment that we can make in that grid and take demand off of it as well, both of those things go together to make sure that we can continue to have that reliable service that we count on. And then on the other side of that, if there are ways to even create ways for you to continue to operate if the grid does not serve you, that's an even more direct way. I'll just share a quick aside. In Louisiana, after Hurricane Ida a couple of years ago, one of the main lessons learned was that after the massive destruction to the electric grid to the transportation network at the time, it was very difficult to get diesel and for generators. So after a couple of days, when generators were still necessary, those who had gasoline and diesel generators were starting to really feel the crunch of that and didn't have fuel available, where those who had solar panels and storage on their homes or businesses or cooling centers at the municipality level, they were able to still operate. So often we think of fossil fuels as our fundamental backup, but in that case, it really proved that in Louisiana, really, fossil fuel capital, you were able to count on renewable energy as that primary.
Also, we have a response in the chat that I just wanted to point out, because not everybody was a recipient to the original message, just about the concern about with rapid sea level rise, and a concern about, like, is this actually all futile? So we've addressed that in the chat, because I think it's something that people are concerned about a lot. Is this all for naught? And it's not. It's an important thing to work alongside adaptation, but there's still lots of opportunity to lessen the severity of climate impacts. So we've got some difficulties. Politics, governments not being ready for the challenge, historic buildings. Yep, and great responses. I suppose we should move on. We have a few more.
Yep.
Okay.
But thanks a lot for all of these responses. These are
terrific.
Great. It's important to keep these kinds of things top of mind, including the challenges, because these things don't happen overnight and don't happen just because the plan is published. That's where we start, and then have to really work through many of those challenges to keep going. So on to the next one. In that transportation category, one that is again, a pretty big change for us here is clean county fleets. So the county maintains, just like most local governments, most institutional entities, they maintain a fleet of vehicles to do the variety of things that they have to do, whether that's, just transporting between county buildings that might be far apart, or doing public works kinds of services to be able to make sure that roads are in good condition, or you're servicing county facilities. So to upgrade county and local government fleets to electric or zero emissions vehicles, and in some cases alternative fuel vehicles where required, this is a very clear act that the county could do. So in order to do that, there's a number of steps you have to go through, identifying gaps in infrastructure, so to make sure that those fleets can be charged properly, putting that investment in chargers that the county could use, and then maybe also the public can use as well. Repairing and updating existing infrastructure, incentivizing and supporting municipalities that are not directly under the county's jurisdiction to be able to convert fleets, or to install different kinds of infrastructure as well. But the direct incentive to the county to be able to do this, there is federal funding for that. There, in some cases, even state support for that. So the last one there kind of ticks into our one of our next ones, which is a land use and zoning component. So making sure that we're enabling the installation of EV chargers and making sure that our vehicles have good places to go, have priority where possible, and also have that ability to charge wherever. So you can see there's a number of potential funding sources there. Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, Clean School Bus Program. Fun fact, South Carolina was the largest recipient of Clean School Bus funding. I think it was last year, maybe the year before, to convert more school buses to electric than any other state. So that's a really major change, and also one that you can just perceive in the streets. That difference between a big, noisy, dirty yellow school bus going down your block versus an electric one. So we'll switch it over to Menti again to take a look at some of these responses. One of the cool things that we've been looking into with some of the conversions of fleets is, because the vehicles that are being produced today are really updated, they're modern, tech focused in some cases. They have a lot more technology to be able to understand, how we're using them. So the county is often looking for, and not just Charleston County, counties across the country are looking for more data about how their own equipment is used. So being able to upgrade some of these will also help in planning. Do we even have to use this vehicle? Do we have to, can we use a different kind of vehicle? Does it go as far as we actually think it does? Are we using it as much as we need to? So one of the things that we've begun discussing is, what does right sizing a fleet look like? When you take that opportunity to replace things, do you replace things one for one? Do you actually get, 2 electric vehicles for what you did have one large vehicle before? Like there are different ways to think about this, and governments, institutions are going through these processes all the time. Being able to also take advantage of that process to lower greenhouse gas emissions is a clear benefit here. So, do we have some responses coming in?
There's also a question in the Q&A that
Mhm.
has Yule's name written all over it. Oh, but I
Did you
guess
get it,
it's
Yule?
just been answered.
Aha.
I guess I would just add, so the question is the study exploring the impacts of scaling up efficient, affordable, and readily available mass transit and multimodal options for residents as an alternative to personal vehicle commutes, as opposed to a direct ICE to electric personal vehicle shift for residents? So we do look at the transportation system in detail, in that we track trips from their origin to their destination by car, by transit, by walking, and by cycling. So we're looking at all modes. And we look at the length of trips to see what the opportunities are for short trips, which could be switched to walking and cycling and electric bikes. So we look at what the potential is there. And then for longer trips, we do look at what the options are for transit. It is very hard to get people out of cars into transit, no matter what you do. Even if you make the transit free, it's still hard because the frequency and the choice is just not equivalent. Transit works really well for certain chunks of the population, but it's hard to have a really significant dent on switching cars to transit trips. So we do look at that and see what opportunities there are. And if there's places where there's a lot of people coming from and a lot of people going. One of the really interesting solutions, I don't know if this is the place where you're going to mention it, Jared, but we found out there's a possibility for some electric ferries in Charleston County that could make a really big difference for a bunch of commuting. So that was one idea that could be, it seems like it could be a really interesting intervention.
There's some really really amazing new ferries that have been put out into regular use, that are really interesting alternatives to what we've seen before. So, you know, there are certainly places where ferry traffic is a lot more common, but partially that's because of the cost to operate them, and the fuel costs. So to have a different alternative that's electric like that is really pretty exciting. All right. Yeah, what would make it difficult? These are two very clear ones: upfront costs and lack of charging infrastructure. Those are those things that do end up in that capital cost bucket for sure. And you know, being able to find ways to either finance those or find grant and incentive programs for them becomes even more important. Looks like there's another comment in the chat here. One suggestion will be, as parking becomes more and more difficult, it's possible to get folks out of their cars. Look at New York City as a city where most people use mass transit. Yeah, nobody wants to park in New York City, and I would argue a lot of people don't want to park in downtown Charleston either. So, you know, that definitely becomes a frustration that turns into sometimes a behavior change. So, so yeah, the more and more cars makes more and more traffic. What else we've got? All right, on to our next one. I think we can slide through a couple more of these. Yeah, this one is very related to that question of what are those alternatives to just replacing cars one-to-one. There's definitely, like I just mentioned, you replace a car one for one, that doesn't actually change your traffic problem. You know, really the number one thing that we hear, I think, talking to folks across Charleston County is traffic, growth. And every time you replace one of those cars, just because it's electric, doesn't mean there's not one fewer car. So I would say being able to look at ways to replace some of those trips, whether they're short trips, or, you know, other ways to be able to get out of your cars, even if it's not 100% of the time. That's what active transportation is all about. So this action is focused on upgrading, expanding, encouraging the use of that alternatives to cars. when we say active transportation, that could mean bike lanes, that could mean, shaded pathways, because shade is at a premium and it's really important when it's hot. Signage to make it clear, making it so that e-bikes are more accessible and there are docks for them, places to lock them up or places to charge them. And then, making sure that those investments in green spaces along those pathways are prioritized as well, because you want to make it so that it's nice to do it. You don't just want to have to make a choice because you have to. You also want to be able to make a choice because you want to. And that's what a lot of this investment is. It's over the course of the past 75 years, we've made lots of investments in cars and making it really easy to drive. We've spent a lot less time and resources here on making it really easy to do all of these other things other than drive. So that's part of what this type of an action is. So there's lots of ways this could go, lots of different options, but it's definitely a solid alternative to the continuing to get in our cars every day. So this is what that might look like. Again, this picture is not Charleston, but just squint your eyes and let's think about it. Being able to increase that the availability of this to make it easy for you. Complete streets is a concept that is used in a lot of places, so that one street can have a lot of different both amenities and accommodations for all people, no matter what kind of transportation they're using. If they're prioritizing walking and biking, those places where you are going, in some cases, the slowest, and you're also the most vulnerable. So making it safe, making it feel very safe as well, is important. Not just, necessarily having to assert yourself on a bike on a busy highway. No one wants to do that. So being able to work on street design to prioritize folks who are the most vulnerable, that's going to be what's important to getting people to choose walking and biking. So again, just a few more examples here. Things like parklets that might do what we just saw in the chat here, which is take away a parking space, but offer a space for lots of different people to hang out in that space. Creating zero emissions buses and dedicated bus lanes. That's one of those things that enables you to take advantage of transit a lot more readily. So it makes it easier. It's a better choice for you to take the bus instead of just feeling like you might have to. It'll get you there faster. That's the goal, but it does take investment and it does take a focus on that. And that one up there on the right is one that I think is pretty important for places throughout the South, which is, you want to make sure that if you are parking somewhere, that you're not going back to a car that's 125 degrees. So being able to create shade and create some renewable energy at the same time, that's an advantage there. All right, back to Menti. Talk about active transportation, going hand in hand with some of those changes to how we get around and, how nice it is to get around. I see a comment in the chat that parklets are not currently allowed in the city of Charleston. It's definitely been a ongoing discussion in communities all over the country the past few years, particularly since they really grew in popularity during the pandemic, getting people outside for businesses. So a lot of that has been influenced by folks thinking that the more you can have someone parking out front, you can have more business in your business, so more revenue at your business. But there have been a lot of studies that really show that that's not necessarily the case. You know, putting 12 people in your parklet that are buying something at your business is likely to be a lot more lucrative than the one person who might have come and parked their car and left it there for 3 hours.
I think there's a Q&A, Ariel, you might be able to answer.
Yeah, I was thinking about it.
Okay.
I mean, I think what I would say now is, I mean, it's something we could potentially recommend as part of the climate action plan, whether it is able to move forward as a policy. I cannot speak to that. So, I mean, that is something that, would be a, a zoning and planning issue. So it's definitely something that we could look into, though.
Are you talking about the transportation services one?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I saw that there was a different question.
The
Okay.
parking minimums, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a question here, another one. I hear a lot of talk on the peninsula about what we're doing as far as the unincorporated areas that have contracted transportation services.
Yes. I wasn't sure what was
Oh.
meant by contracted transportation services.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm not sure if there was I don't think there was really a question. I think it was just a comment. Was there, I think there was a hand up.
It was just a practice round, I think.
Okay. Okay, cool.
All right. It's like we've got some very supportives, couple somewhat supportives of active transportation, benefiting the community in lots of ways, reduced emissions, better physical and mental health outcomes. That's a good one that we mentioned. It's interesting if we went back to that initial pie chart on the Inflation Reduction Act, a big portion of that was health as well. In many cases, a lot of these are going to cross categories. So whether that's cross benefits and how different funding can be used, or really understanding what the initial funding source could be to use it. Not everything that we talk about in a climate action plan has to be funded by something that is called climate action. That's part of the beauty of a climate action plan, where the actions can take a lot of different forms and they can start from a lot of different places. They don't necessarily have to start from a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but that in many ways can be one of the great benefits of that action. See an important point there. Remember the disabled population. Yeah, I think that's a great reminder in terms of the equity concerns here too. Just like so much has been invested in car spaces, there has been a lot of investment in places that are in many ways hostile to those who are disabled or not able to take advantage of that infrastructure in the same way. So that's an important point for equity moving forward in the implementation of these actions. That might make it difficult. Let's see. Time differences, NIMBYs, racists, NIMBYism again, laziness. Don't want to walk or bike, huh? Requires redesign of streets and public rights of way. Yeah, definitely. Dangerous, and yeah, it's unless you have that redesign of streets and rights of way, it certainly can be. Yep. Misconception that people park in front of their businesses. Willingness to get out of the cars. Yeah, limited ability to travel with groups. The only thing I would point out with limited ability to travel with groups is that it's a lot more fun to ride a bike with other people. At least for me. River, water, bridges. Yeah. Yeah. So, many of these are design challenges too. So being able to work on those designs with communities over the course of time that it takes um, to make that change is important. That engagement along the way is just as important as that outcome too. Right, back at it. All right, a renewable energy one this time. Solar farms. This is one that would apply more to some of the rural areas of the county. This action seeks to incentivize and support the development of solar farms in the rural areas of the county. The number of things have to happen for something like this to be implemented: conducting outreach, reducing permitting barriers, making it so that on the planning and zoning side, building solar photovoltaic sites is permitted. That's not always something that's permitted by right. So being able to lower that barrier is important. It needing to provide incentives to solar farm developers, the folks who will take on that initial capital cost and that initial risk. And then facilitating partnerships to connect those developers with landowners. There's definitely a lot of work to be done to identify specifically where those sites would go for the potential for solar energy, just the right aspect and pointing in the right direction. Also balancing the use of those lands. So if that's agriculture land, being able to understand how agriculture can coexist with solar infrastructure or other kinds of infrastructure, or if the land is divided up differently. So there's a lot of different ways to work on this, but it does all take, time, resources, money. There is funding out there for this. The EPA has a Solar for All program. The USDA also administers a program called Rural Energy for America. These are different ways to begin to incentivize that development. We have a special note here that that homeowner and building owner investment in the county already indicates that there's high community readiness for more solar in the county. Oftentimes what you'll see is because of how incentives have worked in the past, there have been state incentives, there have been federal incentives. A lot of that's rooftop solar. So coming to your house, working with you directly, a developer will come and offer an ability to finance solar on your roof to lower your energy costs. Between that and different relationships with the utilities, you're able to then take advantage of that. The solar farm concept goes even beyond that to say that at a larger scale, a whole community could benefit from those lower costs or buying into something that they know has a lower greenhouse gas emissions potential. So let's take a look at what do we think about something like this? Kind of going beyond that rooftop solar, being able to think about rural areas also for being productive for the whole county. You got something for us, Yul?
No, I missed the open question. I was just looking at the answer question. So I was trying to figure out what I was missing, but I figured it out.
Okay.
The question is, how do you evaluate the contribution of the Port of Charleston and local transportation companies to climate initiatives? So there is a I'll type this as well, but there's an accounting protocol for what emissions are in communities or within a community's purview and those that are not. And so any emissions that are combusted within the municipal boundary are included. So for example, if a ship is at port, its emissions would be included, but its emissions associated with getting to the port would not be. In terms of local transportation companies, the same paradigm occurs, except it's a little more complicated in that if a truck is going to do a delivery outside of Charleston County, half of the distance of that trip is included. The other half goes to the jurisdiction which the destination is located. So those are kind of the accounting rules that have developed for how we track emissions for cross-boundary transportation.
I'll also say we had some interesting meetings and discussions with folks to discuss some of the work that's being done at the Port of Charleston. Talking with Charleston County Economic Development Office, we learned about a few programs that are already going on there, including conversion of a lot of the intramodal, so like all of how the things are transported within the port, comes off a ship, moves to something else, moves onto a train. For example, all of those vehicles working to electrify those or make it so that they're not idling in the way that they would otherwise, having plugins for refrigerator trucks, for example, so that you don't have diesel idling for a long time in order to keep whatever you need cold. So some of that work I know is already being done. There's also some really interesting research work that's being done at the port. We've learned when it comes to modeling different scenarios for the electric grid, for example. So there's a lot of good work already being done there, but definitely a good thing to point out in terms of the emissions burden. All right. We got how about incentives for solar rooftops in the chat here? It's like, yeah, I think that's definitely something to keep pushing on here. That's something that we've seen in a lot of states. When those incentives are good, people really take advantage of them and they continue to benefit from them over time. When those incentives start to fall away, it becomes sometimes more difficult. So being able to advocate for more incentives and being able to make it so that the volume actually just naturally reduces the cost of those installations, that becomes an important thing to keep momentum with. So what might make it difficult to implement?
There's a question, maybe Ariel, you might be able to answer in the Q&A. From Gray Gowder.
I do not know the answer to that question.
Certainly, policies around that is something that can be included in this plan. I don't know what the current context is either with respect to what limitations there are, but how solar is deployed on the land is certainly something that would make sense to include in this plan.
Do you know anything about what's happening in other jurisdictions, or is that part of like a land use zoning bylaw in other places?
Yeah, and there's a full range. There's all sorts of guidance on how to integrate with agriculture, how to ensure that it's not impacting agriculture, and certainly lands that are off limits for infrastructure such as solar because of ecological value. And there is no reason why one shouldn't be able to do a lot of solar within Charleston County without causing any incremental damage to ecological systems. There's a lot of space between rooftops and already disturbed land that should not be an issue.
Yeah, I'll take a note of that and I can send that out as part of the follow-up, because that's a really interesting question and there definitely has to be something in place, but I just don't know the details of it.
pertaining to another question in the Menti around people not liking the look of it, there could also be policies related to privacy screens or vegetation buffers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so that has come up, and I know we have Katie McCain on the call who works for the city, has come up for issues downtown for rooftop solar, for not liking the look of it, for the historic Charleston. You know, that's been an issue with solar.
All right. I think we've got one more to go through here, which is related to that green infrastructure idea. So not green infrastructure in the sense like per se of managing water in the way that we discussed, but increasing tree cover, which we know has a multitude of benefits. In some cases, that is holding more water and types of trees planted. In other cases, the tree cover itself can reduce heat exposure and make it so that you do not have to cool a space as much. So which again, in turn has energy benefits. So there are a few things that have to happen in order to work on this. And particularly here, you'll see increased tree cover in low income and priority neighborhoods. This is definitely something that has had equity implications over the years. It's very clear. You don't need to read an academic study to know that lower income neighborhoods often have fewer trees and fewer street trees in quality large trees in the neighborhoods. This is a way to help address that as well. But stepwise to get there, conducting a tree survey, providing grants and technical assistance to plant them and maintain them. That's also very important. That maintenance part is so often forgotten or difficult to fund. So taking advantage of grants and different ways to finance that maintenance becomes really important. Requiring buildings and properties, municipal buildings and properties, to plant new trees if anything needed to be taken out or moved during construction, or even if they don't have to. Those kinds of policies and regulations to increase tree cover rather than just replace can also be important. And then last one here, requiring or incentivizing private developers and property owners to plant new trees throughout that process. So there's a municipal action, there's a private property action. All of those things can work together to increase that tree cover. I know there was a study recently that I think it was like 10,000 acres of forest land was lost in the county over the past few decades, just due to growth and development, to big storms. That is a really major loss, and the kind of statistic that can really help inform a goal for how to plant more. Are you going to achieve that cover that you had 70 years ago? Maybe not, but to be able to really work on that and integrate it into the urban and suburban fabric, that's just as important. So one of the key funding sources here is USDA, again, urban and community forest grants. And there are other things that contribute to this as well. This is one that a lot of people can get involved in, which is nice. Volunteer efforts and community organizations have a clear role in this action. So let's take a look at what people think. We got a 1, we got a 3, we got a 4. Yeah, this is one that, I would say is in many ways kind of universally liked and definitely has some clear benefits. Does it have the most direct greenhouse gas emissions reduction benefit? not necessarily compared to a lot of these retrofits and a lot of the changes in our built environment. But this again enables all kinds of other changes and increases that improves that quality of life across.
Speaking of enabling actions,
Hey,
we have a little bit of a detour in the chat. Not everyone can see it, but there's a comment about a basic problem that we have is much of the Low Country has situations with multiple jurisdictions. Maybe Ariel, you want to explain that a bit more, but in any case, the kind of different rules for different places that are very close together creates a complicated situation. So that's a great example of the type of enabling action, that underlying precondition that will create a situation that it does make these things possible in a way that's consistent in communities that are neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this in many different avenues, so many of you have probably heard me say this before, but as the county, we have jurisdiction only over our unincorporated areas. I think we have 16 different municipalities in our jurisdiction, like geographically within the county. So it's really challenging, especially with these sustainability climate issues. The climate does not stop in these boundaries, and so it's imperative that we all work together. And it's really challenging. Another challenge is that with these sustainability and climate positions, there's very few of us currently in the Charleston region. So we're doing our best to work together where we can, is what I put in the chat, with sustainability and resilience. And the city of Charleston already has a plan. They've had a climate action plan for a couple years, so we're following their lead in that sense. And there's a few other of the larger municipalities are on board, and we're working very closely with them, and we're hoping to work with some of the other, all of the municipalities. But yeah, it's absolutely a challenge. Some of the other municipalities are quite small and don't necessarily have the resources to work on these issues. So we're doing the best we can, and it continues to be a challenge, and we're continuing to work on it. So yeah, it's definitely continues to be a regional challenge, and it kind of works the same everywhere, where we're trying to all work together on these issues.
Thanks a lot, Ariel. I mean, that's one of those universal complications of working in government, for sure. None of the problems stop at the end of the
no easy way to solve it, for sure.
Nope. All right. What makes it difficult? Yeah, cost, for sure. It's true. It's not cheap to plant and maintain trees, especially the kinds of trees that will lead long, sustainable lives and native and have as native plantings. Sorry. Perception that will lead to gentrification. Yeah, that is definitely something we've heard as well. I think this is where not just thinking about one outcome, but trying to think about how can we pair a lot of different actions to make sure that there's an equitable outcome is important. I'd argue that in most cases, if we just choose one thing to optimize for, we're probably going to get some questionable outcomes on some other part. But if we have a whole suite of actions working together, that's how we can start to avoid some of those kinds of challenges. Utility crews butchering trees. Yeah, not every utility crew has arborists on staff. That is for sure. So creating those standards, and it can definitely be important. Maintenance, government, pure and simple, as a challenge. Yeah, because that kind of priority and prioritization often can be difficult to do quickly in the way that it needs to be done, especially when we're talking about development. Keeping up with the pace of private development can be tough for government to keep up with that too. Stewardship, maintenance, yes, all these things, definite challenges, and definite things that need to be incorporated into a program to ensure the sustainability of the program, and then also the effectiveness of it as a climate action. So,
Okay,
I
so
think-
let's move along. I think at this point, unless you have any pressing other comments, we have 10 minutes and just a little bit more to go over. Actually, mainly just some questions or observations. If you'd like to speak, now is the perfect time. We have a few closing remarks after that as well, but we have a few minutes to, if there's anything that you feel hasn't been covered here. Obviously, that's not the entire climate action plan. So we have another Mentimeter if you'd like to use that to provide other actions that you think are important.
And if you want to speak, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you. It's raising.
Yeah. We just got a question about
Okay.
whether we will have a copy of this presentation available, which I think will be the case on the.
I think you should be able to talk now.
Okay.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Hey, this is Adam Friend. I guess I'd like to understand a little better. I don't recognize you guys, and I know there's a lot of folks in the county I don't know, but who are you guys working with? Is county council involved with a lot of this decision making, or are you dealing with Mr. Adams with Public Works? Like, I just don't understand or necessarily know where you guys fall under that paradigm.
I can speak to that. Yeah, so sorry, we probably should have done some more introductions. We had a lot of material to get through. So I'm Ariel Gerstein, and I'm the sustainability manager for the county. I fall under general services at the county, the DCA for general services, directly under that county administrator. And everyone who presented here is SSG or Civic, so they're consultants that have been hired on for this project. So they're not local to Charleston. We are going in front of county council. So we briefed county council once, and we plan to brief them again. We're going to have a timeline slide at the end, but it's likely going to be early March. And then we are aiming to brief them a third time for approval of the plan in early April. So we are on a timeline with county council to get this approved. Although the plan is for the whole county, like my position specifically is under general services. So that's mainly, I guess, who it's working with. It's working with everyone: facilities, fleet, stormwater, environmental management, all of the areas where it affects economic development, all those kinds.
Are you feeling supported in this currently? Are you feeling like this is something that people are listening to, or is it just too early in the game to know?
Yeah, I think it's one of these plans that's hard because, as you probably heard, it goes to 2050. So it's a very long-term plan. So that can be overwhelming for people to kind of grasp the long-term, and it feels aggressive because it's so long-term. So, and change is always really hard for everyone. So I think that people are supportive, but they want to understand what the investment is going to be, and then what the savings is going to be, and how it's going to impact the county and all these things. So even after we get it passed, we're still going to have to take these actions through council. So it's going to give us a formality of a plan to have actions that we want to do, but it doesn't mean that now we have permission to do actions through 2050 for all of these actions. So it's basically a structure that we're going to follow, a framework. But I would say, yeah, it's been positive. We briefed council in December and we got positive feedback. Really, the only feedback we received, it was mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, was the equity component that they really wanted to make sure that we integrated equity into the plan.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate
that helps. Yeah.
And we'd like to just, the more citizens that you can get educated and on board with this, I think the farther that this will go for you guys. And I don't know how we can help you there, but I think this is something that people are going to have to get their head around and understand where there's benefit here. I just think some people are going to be like, oh gosh, there's tree huggers, or I don't know. I just feel like in the Low Country there's a lot of resistance to change. Period. So it's going to be something that we need to help them understand the importance of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've done a lot of outreach, and I think, I mean, there's always education with these things, and there will be opportunity for people to comment once our full draft comes out. This was just a very high level overview tonight. So, if people are interested in seeing the plan, they'll be, able to see it more in depth. But yeah, hopefully that kind of gives you an overview of what we're planning to do. But we definitely want people to stay involved, assuming it's approved, after it's approved for implementation, because that's really going to be where the real work starts.
Sure. Well, thank you for listening and then for putting this on.
Oh, no, thank you for attending. Appreciate it.
Yep.
We've got about 3 more minutes, and I think we need to make sure that you know the next steps. So we will keep on trucking.
So we just wanted to give some suggestions about how you can continue to be engaged. And thank you, Adam. That was very helpful in terms of sort of setting the stage. Certainly reading and reviewing the draft plan when it comes out, and providing comments and talking to friends and neighbors about this project so that there is a high level of awareness. Participate in the upcoming council meetings, which are actually quite interesting. And then also champion an action. And I think focusing on one action that is of interest is a really good strategy, because you can learn a lot about it and learn how to implement it. So if you keep going to the next slide, and the next one, I think we can skip over that one. This is the key. This is the timeline. So the document itself will be available in early March for public comment. There'll be a council briefing also in early March on the draft plan, and then we are targeting council approval for early April. And I just wanted to follow up with the introductory survey that Erica did. For those of you who are curious to learn animal, here's a really neat film from Florida about someone who learned turkey. So that can be a really good way to round out the presentation.
Palate cleanser.
Thank you.
It's actually
And
a really fascinating film.
I was just gonna say, back to the climate action plan. If you're not signed up for my e-alerts, then I will send you the link once I send out the recording. And please sign up for those, because I will keep you up to date with the announcements. And if you ever want to come to one of our council briefings and show support for the plan or anything like that, then that would be great. So thank you so much for your support and attendance, and have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you.